Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to lecture 2 of our series Fine-Tuning of the Universe. And we are going to finish up our introduction to the topic before we actually delve into the science. If you remember, we had defined fine-tuning in the first lecture, basically that if we change any of the constants of nature by even a little bit or the initial conditions, it turns out that the universe would be an entirely different place, and how this was, number one, a surprise to scientists. Number two, that this is not a religiously motivated set of ideas. This did not come about by a bunch of religionists or even a bunch of religious scientists trying to find a way to make science bolster their religious beliefs. This was an entirely purely scientific endeavor with rather surprising discoveries, which turn out to have significant theological implications. And so you see that this is a big deal. Here is a workshop at Trinity College in Oxford called Life in the Universe, and it's about the physics of fine-tuning. And so this has become now a very significant mainstream topic. And I would like to begin this lecture with, again, the observations of a variety of distinguished scientists about this notion of fine-tuning. So Dr. Dennis Scania, he is the head of the Cambridge University Observatories, and he says if you change a little bit the laws of nature, or you change a little bit the constants of nature, like the charge on the electron, then the way the universe develops is so changed, it is very likely that intelligent life would not have been able to develop. Now, once again, why is this significant? Because if the universe arose by chance or haphazardly, if life was a chance occurrence, we would expect a rather large tolerance of these constants of nature to the notion of life, that there would be a fairly broad range where life of some sort could have developed, and we were lucky enough to be somewhere in that range, not a situation where the universe is balanced on a razor's edge in terms of the development of life. Now, Dr. David Deutsch, very, very famous scientist at the Institute of Mathematics at Oxford, he says if we nudge one of these constants just a few percent in one direction, stars burn out within 1 million years of their formation, and there's no time for evolution. If we nudge it a few percent in the other direction, then no elements heavier than helium form, no carbon, no life, not even chemistry, no complexity at all. So you see, again, that very, very significant heavyweight scientific opinions, entirely devoid of a religious motivation, are coming out and saying, hey, look at this amazing discovery, how fine-tuned the universe is for the existence of life. Again, Dr. Paul Davies, we've heard of him before, and he says the really amazing thing is not that life on Earth is balanced on a knife edge, but that the entire universe is balanced on a knife edge and would be total chaos if any of the natural constants were off even slightly. You see, Davies adds, even if you dismiss man as a chance happening, the fact remains that the universe seems unreasonably suited to the existence of life, almost contrived, you might say a put-up job. And of course, for us as religionists, we wouldn't say almost contrived, we would say that it is perfectly designed by the creator of the universe. And again, Stephen Hawking, who I'm sure you are all familiar with, he refers to this phenomena as remarkable. He says the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers, i.e. the constants of physics, seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. And Hawking says, if the electric charge of the electron had been only slightly different, stars would have been unable to burn hydrogen and helium, or else they would not have exploded. And that explosion is critical to spread elements like carbon, which make us up. So that's not a bad thing. That's an important thing, a critical thing for life that we will talk about later, inshallah, in this course. And it seems clear that there are relatively few ranges of values for the numbers, for the constants, that would allow for the development of any form of intelligent life. Most sets of values would give rise to universes that, although they might be very beautiful, would contain no one able to wonder at that beauty. Again, I don't want to kind of overdo this, but so many comments from Nobel Prize winners. I mean, recipient of 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry, Ilya Prigogine, saying that the statistical probability that organic structures and the most precisely harmonized reactions that typify living organisms would be generated by accident is 0. And so that is a very important statement from a recipient of 2 Nobel Prizes. And Steven Weinberg, again, Nobel laureate in physics, and to the best of my awareness, an avowed atheist, says how surprising it is that the laws of nature and the initial conditions of the universe should allow for the existence of beings who could observe it. Life as we know it would be impossible if any one of several physical quantities had slightly different values. So to us, this has significant theological implications. It resonates very well with our picture of creation. When we see in the Quran that in Surah Ar-Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ, and the firmament he has raised, and he has set up the balance. Now here in this translation, it says justice, but I have always understood the balance to also mean the very finely balanced set of physical laws and constants to make the universe possible. So that is how I understand al-Mizan, and God knows best. And again, in Surah Al-Qamar, Inna kulla shay'in khalaqnahu biqadar. Verily, all things we have created in proportion and measure. And fine-tuning tells us how precise and how delicate and how incredibly balanced this proportion and this measure is. That there is really no tolerance for change. It is perfectly created. And again, why is this significant? Well, we looked at Newton's law of universal gravitation as an example of a physical law. And Newton and scientists of his generation believed very strongly that when they discovered these physical laws, this was an indication of the divine intellect that had created the universe. To them, their discovery of the laws of nature was a support of their faith, an expression of their faith, but also reciprocally something which validated their faith. That when they discovered a beautiful law of nature, like the law of universal gravitation, this was a direct reflection of the divine intellect. And it was their task and their privilege to be able to participate in uncovering some of these laws. So Newton, for example, said in his Principia that though these bodies may indeed persevere in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have at first derived the regular position of the orbits themselves from those laws. Thus, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only have proceeded from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being, that being, of course, being God. So Newton is saying, yes, we have a physical law that explains how the earth rotates around the sun, but that law is not enough to explain how this is a stable system, because if you just were to create the sun and then put the earth at the current distance from the sun, the earth would simply fall into the sun. It needed to be in an orbit and then gravity maintaining this orbit so that the Earth doesn't fly off and doesn't fall into the sun, but has a stable orbit, and that this set of initial conditions had to be from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So Newton, the discovery of Newton's laws, not only of universal gravitation, but Newton's laws of motion, which really was the beginning of Enlightenment physics, if you will. It was the beginning of the scientific revolution. And all of you who have studied physics in high school and in college, you know Isaac Newton, you have gone through Newton's laws of motion and so forth. This was his belief about his work in science. Now, interestingly, as the pendulum swung away from religiosity and scientific materialism, and again, I don't mean here materialism in economic terms, the philosophy of scientific materialism, that there is matter, there's energy, there are the laws of physics, and there's nothing else. There is no divine intellect behind any of this. Newton's work was turned around, despite his personal views, or opposite to his personal views, as a very strong support for scientific materialism. So the notion was, hey, we have the sun, we have the earth, we now understand why the earth orbits the sun and why it stays in a stable orbit because of the law of universal gravitation. So we no longer, if you will, need the hand of God, to coin a phrase, to be holding the earth in orbit around the sun. So Laplace, and again, those of you who have studied mathematics and philosophy are familiar with his name. In his famous work, Celestial Mechanics, he basically took Newton's mechanics and tried to extend it to explain all of sort of celestial phenomena in a massive work known as the Celestial Mechanics. And Napoleon, who was a surprisingly erudite man and read Laplace's treatise, asked him, why was there not a single mention of God in Laplace's entire 5 volumes explaining how the heavens operated? And Laplace's reply to Napoleon was that he, quote, had no need for that particular hypothesis. For us as people of faith, of course, our response is astaghfirullah, but it shows you how the philosophical outlook can change the interpretation of science. That science can be used as an expression and a support of faith, or it can be used as just the opposite. So we saw that the pendulum swung away from atheistic interpretation of the laws of nature to a scientific materialistic interpretation of the laws of nature. And the reason I am so interested in the field of fine-tuning, besides, of course, the wonderful science, is that I believe that these discoveries of the last 50 years have now swung the pendulum back. That it is very difficult to study the science of fine-tuning and walk away feeling that this universe was not designed, and not only designed, but intricately and perfectly designed. And as I said in the first lecture, when I have presented some of this material to young Western Muslims, they have found it a tremendous support to their notion of faith, because they did not feel in a position to be able to reply to the message of scientific materialism that they are continuously getting. And there's probably, lest you think I'm exaggerating, there is probably no better example than, here's an article in the Washington Times about Antony Flew. I don't know if you are familiar with his name, but Antony Flew is a very well-known philosophy professor of the second half of the 20th century he was in fact the leading voice of the atheist movement. He was the leading intellectual proponent and support of atheism, putting atheism on an intellectual footing. So he was considered the sort of, not just a person who happened to be a lifelong atheist. Well, why in the world would the Washington Times write about just a guy who was an atheist? This was the intellectual leader of the atheist movement. His works were incredibly famous to those interested in this field. His essay, Theology and Falsification, his famous work, The Presumption of Atheism, they were the intellectual underpinnings of the atheist movement of the mid to late 20th century. And when Antony Flew studied the physics of fine-tuning at 81 years of age, after decades that belief is a mistake, he then changed his mind and concluded that some sort of intelligence or first cause must have created the universe. He could not, in good conscience, look at the data that was coming out in terms of fine-tuning and maintain his atheism. And a superintelligence is the only good explanation for the origin of life and the complexity of nature, Mr. Flew said in a telephone interview with the Washington Times. And more than that, he himself wrote a book. And you see the title of the book, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind by Antony Flew. And he wrote a book, There Is, instead of No, There Is a God, explaining his change of conviction. And of course, this raised a firestorm in the atheist movement. And he was accused of, having a last-minute panic because he was 81 and realized he was going to die and was trying to hedge his bets and all of this. And Antony Flew came back and said, absolutely not. The data I am following in his book, when you read his book, says I am following the same method I have always followed. But now there's new data at hand, and that same method now leads me to a different conclusion. And for those of you who think that this is because I am afraid that maybe I'm wrong and I would go to hell, I don't believe in an afterlife. But I do believe that there is a God who must have created this universe. So this is the significance, and this is the power, and this is the stature of the topic that we are discussing. It's not just a bunch of dry scientific ideas. I know not everyone is interested in science, and if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I go into a good bit of detail, but I hope, inshallah, that I have given you some motivation to persevere through the detail and to see some of the magic. If Antony Flew could, then you and I, inshallah, can as well. So with that, I say take care and God bless. And with our next lecture, we will then begin the science of fine-tuning. Assalamu alaikum.